The words died in Theodora Holloway's throat before she could even shape them properly. She had rehearsed them a dozen times while standing at the small cracked mirror above the wash basin in her rented room at the Dusty Creek boarding house. She had practiced the angle of her chin, the steadiness of her voice, the precise arrangement of her gratitude into something that would not embarrass her or overwhelm him. She had been ready. She had been absolutely certain she was ready. And then Louis Barlow looked up from the fence post he was mending, his dark eyes catching the slant of the late afternoon sun, and every carefully constructed sentence she had built dissolved like sugar in a rainstorm. "Mr. Barlow," she started, her voice carrying more trembling than she intended, "I need you to know what you did for me yesterday was fence posts rotting at the base," he said, not unkindly, but with a complete and total redirection that felt like stepping onto a bridge and finding it had been replaced by solid ground beneath your feet. He tapped the wood with the butt of his hammer. "See how the grain splits here. Another 2 weeks and the whole east corner of the property comes down." Theodora stared at him. He was already crouching again, pressing his thumb into the soft wood with the focused attention of a man who genuinely cared about fence posts. She stood there on the dry Nevada soil in the summer of 1882, the heat pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy hand, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she had absolutely no category for. Something warm and completely unexpected, and she realized with a slow, dawning terror, entirely dangerous, because no man had ever changed the subject when she tried to thank him. Every man she had ever known in her 26 years of living had either leveraged gratitude for his own gain or soaked in the praise like a cloth in water, expanding with it, needing more. Her late husband, Gerald Holloway, God rest whatever was left of his calculating soul, had once accepted her tearful thanks for simply not spending their grocery money at the card tables for an entire month, and had let her thank him for 20 minutes before steering the gratitude toward a request for a new saddle. Louis Barlow changed the subject and talked about a fence post. And God help her, that was the moment Theodora Holloway began to fall. But the falling had not been inevitable when she first arrived in Rattlesnake Flat, Nevada. Nothing about her arrival in that dust-choked, sun-bleached town on a Thursday in early June had felt like the beginning of anything except possibly the end of several things. She had stepped off the Southern Pacific Railroad line at the small junction station at Mineral Wells, 30 miles north of Rattlesnake Flat, with 2 carpet bags, a hat box, and a letter of introduction that had been written for a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Hallam of St. Louis, Missouri. The letter was meant for the schoolteacher position at the Rattlesnake Flat Consolidated School, a one-room building that served the children of ranchers, miners, and the small but determined community of settlers who had carved the town out of the Nevada basin in the mid-1870s. Theodora was not Dorothea Hallam. Dorothea Hallam had died of typhoid fever on the Missouri River in March, 3 weeks before her planned departure for Nevada, and her older sister, who had been living in the same boarding house, who had also been a teacher, who had also been recently widowed and entirely without prospects, had made a decision that she would later describe to herself as practical and to others as something she simply did not discuss. She had taken the letter and the position, and she had come west. She told herself it was not deception, it was close enough to truth. Her name was Theodora, not Dorothea, but the consonants lived in the same neighborhood. She had taught at the Millbrook Academy for Girls in Ohio for 4 years before her marriage to Gerald Holloway. She was qualified. She was capable. She needed the work and the distance from St. Louis more desperately than she had ever needed anything in her adult life. What she had needed distance from, specifically, was a man named Philip Crane. Philip Crane was Gerald Holloway's business partner, and after Gerald's death from a heart seizure at the poker table in January of 1882, Philip Crane had revealed himself to be a man who believed that the widows of his partners were among the assets of the partnership. He had made this belief explicit in multiple uncomfortable conversations. He had made it physical once, in the hallway outside Gerald's old office, and Theodora had driven her elbow into his ribcage with a precision that had surprised them both. She had left St. Louis within a week. She had arrived in Rattlesnake Flat by early June, and for the first 2 weeks the deception held with surprising ease. The school board, composed of 3 ranchers and the town's single banker, cared considerably less about her actual name and considerably more about whether she could keep 32 children from various stages of wildness sitting in seats and learning their arithmetic. She could. She did. The children responded to her because she was neither cruel nor soft, and she understood that the best thing you could do for a child who had grown up watching the land demand everything of their parents was to show them that learning was not an enemy of survival but a tool of it. She was settling in. She was almost, cautiously, beginning to breathe. And then Deputy Marshal Crane arrived in Rattlesnake Flat. She learned his new title before she saw his face. She overheard 2 men talking at the dry goods store on a Wednesday afternoon. Something about the new federal deputy coming through the territory to investigate land claim fraud, and the name Philip Crane passed between them like a perfectly ordinary thing, and Theodora had to grip the counter to keep from folding. He had taken a federal appointment. He had come west. Whether he had come west because of her or because of the land claim work, she did not know. But she knew with the absolute animal certainty of a woman who had spent a year being watched by a dangerous man that he would find her the moment he saw her name on the school registry, and the fact that it was written as T. Holloway rather than Theodora would buy her approximately nothing. She had gone directly to the boarding house and begun calculating. She needed to either disappear again or find some form of protection that Philip Crane, with his new federal badge and his old assumption that the world arranged itself around his desires, would respect. She did not have enough money to leave. The school board had paid her a partial advance, but the full month's salary would not come until the end of June, and she was already behind on her board bill at Mrs. Fenter's establishment. She had been sitting on the edge of her bed, the letter from St. Louis that had started all of this pressed flat on her knee, staring at the cracked plaster of the boarding house wall, when Mrs. Fenter knocked and told her there was a man downstairs asking whether any of the boarders had found a brown leather notebook, lost somewhere between the general store and the post office. Theodora had gone down because she was not the kind of woman who could sit still in a crisis, and because she had, in fact, found a brown leather notebook that morning wedged under the step of the post office, which she had picked up and set on Mrs. Fenter's entry table with the intention of asking about it later. The man standing in Mrs. Fenter's parlor was Louis Barlow. She would not have been able to pick him out of a description. He was not the tallest man she had ever seen, nor the broadest. He was rangy in the way that men who work land rather than lift things tend to be, with the kind of lean toughness that comes from 1,000 early mornings and not from display. He had dark hair that needed cutting, dark eyes that did not need anything, and the kind of quietness about him that Theodora initially mistook for shyness. She would come to understand that it was not shyness at all. It was the quietness of a man who had learned that most words were wasted, and who chose his with the care of someone spending the last of his coin. "Mr. Barlow, Mrs. Fenter said with the particular tone she used for men she respected, "This is Miss Holloway. She found your notebook this morning." "Mrs. Holloway," Theodora said automatically, then wished she had not. She was trying not to think about the past. It was on the step at the post office. She retrieved it from the entry table and held it out to him. He took it, checked the inside cover, and said, "Thank you," in a voice that suggested he meant it the way a man means something he is not going to elaborate on. He did not leave immediately, which she found interesting. He asked Mrs. Fenter something about the water supply to the south edge of town, and then he asked Theodora with the same mild directness, "You're the new school teacher." "I am," she said, My neighbor's children are enrolled, the Vasquez family. Their boy Ernesto is 8, good kid. He is, she agreed, and she meant it. Ernesto Vasquez was one of the quick ones, the children who scared you a little with how fast they absorbed things. He's reading 3 years above his level. Something shifted in Louis Barlow's face. Not a smile exactly, but the territory a smile occupied. His father will want to hear that, he said. He left after that, and Theodora did not give him another thought for 3 days. The 3 days were occupied almost entirely by the deepening crisis of Philip Crane's presence in the territory. She had heard by Thursday that he was staying at the Silver Eagle Hotel, the only establishment in Rattlesnake Flat with genuine glass windows, and that he had been conducting meetings with the land office and the county registrar. She had heard by Friday that he had asked someone in the general store whether there were any recent arrivals from St. Louis, and she had felt the walls of her careful constructed safety begin to crumble at the edges. She made herself go to school on Friday because not going would have been conspicuous, and because the children deserved better than a teacher who disappeared when her own life became complicated. She taught her lessons. She graded the arithmetic slates during the noon hour. She read aloud from a geography text after lunch because geography was about the world being larger than any one crisis. And then on Saturday morning, while she was hanging her washing on the line behind the boarding house, Philip Crane walked around the corner of the building and looked at her with the expression of a man who had found something he believed he owned. "Theodora," he said, using her first name like a form of possession, "I heard you'd come west. I wasn't sure whether to be touched or insulted that you didn't write." She did not run. Running was what he wanted because running confirmed something. She gathered the wet sheet she was holding and draped it over the line with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I had understood you were occupied with your business in St. Louis." "Business has a way of following a man," he said, and he smiled in the way he always smiled, which was with his mouth entirely and his eyes not at all. "I've taken a federal appointment, deputy marshal. It gives me a great deal of flexibility about where I operate." "How fortunate for you," she said. He stepped closer. He had always been a man who used physical proximity as a weapon, who understood that presence alone could make a woman feel trapped. She stood her ground because she had no other option, and because the washing line was between them, but she could see in his face that he was calculating, and what he was calculating was how long it would take to dismantle the life she had assembled here. "You're living under a false name," he said, pleasantly. "Teaching under credentials that aren't entirely yours. That's a federal matter in a territory school, Theodora. Fraud against a public institution." "My qualifications are genuine," she said. "I taught for 4 years in Ohio." "Your name on that application is not genuine," he said. "I wonder what the school board would make of that." He tilted his head slightly. "Unless, of course, you and I came to some kind of arrangement." There it was. She had known it was coming, and still the words landed in her stomach like stones in still water. "There will be no arrangement," she said. His expression did not change. "Think about it carefully," he said. "I'll give you until Monday." He left, and Theodora stood at the washing line for a full minute before she realized she was shaking. She spent the rest of Saturday and the whole of Sunday in a particular kind of careful misery, the kind that comes from being trapped in a situation where every visible exit leads somewhere worse. She could not stay and submit to Crane's pressure. She could not afford to leave. She could not expose the deception herself, because that would give him exactly what he wanted, the leverage to have her arrested or humiliated or both. She could not go to the sheriff, because Crane was a federal deputy and Rattlesnake Flats sheriff. A decent but cautious man named Albright would not challenge federal authority on the word of a woman with a complicated history. She thought about it all through Saturday night and all through the quiet Sunday morning, and by Sunday afternoon she had arrived at something that was not quite a plan but was at least a direction. She went to find Louis Barlow. She did not entirely know why. She knew almost nothing about the man. She knew he owned the property adjacent to the Vasquez Ranch to the southeast of town, that he had lost his notebook and been grateful without being elaborate about it, and that he had said something kind about Ernesto Vasquez with the matter-of-fact sincerity of a man who did not say things he did not mean. She found him because Rattlesnake Flat was a small town and because Mrs. Fenter, when asked, said that Louis Barlow was at the livery most Sunday afternoons because he had an arrangement with old Seth Granger to help with the horses in exchange for pasture rights. She walked to the livery on the edge of town with her best hat on and her spine very straight, and the careful speech she had constructed dissolving slightly more with each step, and she found him inside the dim, hay-smelling space, brushing down a bay mare with the thoroughness of a man who believed that whatever was worth doing completely. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and he did not look surprised, which surprised her. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "I need to speak with you," she said, "about something that may sound strange." "All right," he said, and set down the brush and gave her his full attention with the ease of someone who was not arranging his face for the purpose. She told him, not everything, not the full, uncomfortable history of Gerald and the partnership in the hallway outside the office, but enough. She told him about Philip Crane and the pressure he was applying, and the fact that her name on the school application was not precisely her name, though her credentials were real and her teaching was genuine. She told him she needed some form of protection that a federal deputy would respect, and that she had no money and no family in the territory, and no one in Rattlesnake Flat who knew her well enough to speak for her. She told him all of this while standing in the livery doorway with her hat on and her voice steady, and she felt exposed in the particular way that comes from telling the truth to a stranger and not knowing whether it is safe. Louis Barlow listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the blankness of someone who has not understood, but the stillness of someone who is thinking. "Crane has a federal appointment, but he's working county land claims," he said. "That means his jurisdiction is specific. He can't arrest a schoolteacher for naming irregularities on a territorial application without going through the county board of education, and they'd want to keep the school running. He's bluffing, or he's planning to leverage the threat rather than the action. He wants an arrangement," she said, and she let the word carry exactly what it meant. Louis Barlow's expression changed then, and it was the first time she saw something other than calm in his face. It was brief and controlled, but it was there, a flash of something she recognized as anger of the righteous variety, the kind that a man feels not for his own sake. "I'll speak to him," he said. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said simply. "What will you say?" she asked. "Something that makes the bluff not worth calling," he said. "I've got some standing in this county. Family land goes back to the early settlements. The county registrar owes me a conversation he'd prefer not to have about how that southern parcel was recorded in 1879. He said it without pride, as if he were reporting a fact about the weather. I don't use it usually, but it's there." "That would put you in an uncomfortable position," she said. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes and said, "The fence post on the south corner needs replacing. I've been meaning to get to it." She blinked. "I'm sorry. I've been putting off that repair," he said. "Be good to have a reason to get started on it." And he picked up the brush and went back to the bay mare in the completely calm way of a man who had decided something and did not feel the need to talk about it further. Theodora walked back to the boarding house in a state of confusion that felt, strangely, like relief. He spoke to Crane on Monday morning. She did not witness it. She heard about it third hand through the particular social telegraph that operates in small western towns, by which information travels from the Silver Eagle Hotel through the general store, through Mrs. Fenter's kitchen, with a speed and accuracy that would embarrass some newspaper operations. What she heard was that Louis Barlow had a conversation with Deputy Marshal Crane in the hotel lobby that lasted approximately 15 minutes and ended with Crane leaving for the land office with an expression that suggested he had been informed of something he did not enjoy knowing. She heard nothing more from Philip Crane that week. By Wednesday, she had begun to breathe again. By Friday, she had started to notice things about Louis Barlow that she had not permitted herself to notice, while she was too frightened to notice anything. He was at the school that Friday afternoon because his neighbor's children, 3 of the Vasquez young ones including Ernesto, had apparently needed a ride back to the ranch, and their father had sent Louis since he was coming into town anyway. He arrived a few minutes before the dismissal bell, which was not a bell at all but Theodora striking a steel rod against a piece of railway iron mounted outside the door, and he waited by the hitching post with the patient ease of a man who did not consider waiting beneath him. She watched him through the window while the children gathered their slates and their lunch pails, and she thought about how he had simply said, "I'll speak to him," without calculating what was in it for himself, without making her feel the weight of the favor, without asking for her gratitude in advance or retrospectively. She watched him lift young Ernesto Vasquez onto the wagon seat with one arm and a complete casualness, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and she thought that, whatever Louis Barlow was, he was something she had not encountered before, and something she was not entirely prepared for. She came out into the afternoon sun and he nodded at her and she said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Barlow," and he said, "Afternoon, Mrs. Holloway," and the 3 Vasquez children tumbled into the wagon bed, and that was all that happened. But in the entirely ordinary 3 minutes of it, something had decided itself in Theodora's chest. She did not act on it. She was not a foolish woman, and she had a complicated history with men making decisions that complicated her life, and she was not about to add her own complications to the pile. But she noticed, and she thought. And the noticing and thinking continued through the weekend, and into the following week, with the quiet persistence of water finding its way through rock. She began to see him regularly because Rattlesnake Flat was a small town, and because the school was on the main road that Louis Barlow traveled when he came in from his property for supplies. She began to know when to expect him by some combination of habit pattern, and the particular attention her mind paid to his schedule without being asked to. She told herself this was simply the natural awareness that develops in small communities, which it partially was, and she said nothing to anyone, which was the correct decision. She learned things about him through the accumulation of small observations. He bought his provisions once a week, always on Tuesday or Wednesday, never varied the day by more than 24 hours. He had a standing credit at the hardware store but paid cash at the dry goods, which suggested he trusted the hardware man more. He was on first-name terms with the Vasquez family, with Seth Granger at the livery, and with the Mexican silversmith on the south end of Main Street, whose name was Roberto Ochoa, and whose work Louis apparently respected enough to have commissioned a bridal fitting. He was not on first-name terms with the banker, or with either of the 2 men on the school board who had land adjacent to his. She learned that his family had come to Nevada in 1864, that his father had died in 1878 from something the county records listed as fever, that he had a younger sister living in San Francisco who wrote him letters that he collected at the post office with a visible softening of his face that he probably did not know was visible. She learned these things the way you learn things about someone whose story you have started to follow even before you understand why, and she filed them away in the particular room of her mind she did not examine too closely. Philip Crane stayed in Rattlesnake Flat for another 3 weeks, conducting his land claim investigation with visibly diminished enthusiasm for the social opportunities the town offered. He did not approach Theodora again. She saw him twice in passing on Main Street, and both times he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding whether to try a different approach. Both times, by some coincidence or design she could not entirely determine, Louis Barlow had been somewhere nearby, once coming out of the hardware store directly behind her, once riding past the Main Street on his way from the livery. She asked him once carefully whether he was arranging to be present. He looked at the middle distance. "Had some errands," he said. She let it go. Crane left for the county seat at the end of June without having taken any action against her, and Theodora allowed herself one full evening of relief before turning back to the considerable business of simply living. The school board paid her June salary on the last Friday of the month, and she paid Mrs. Fenter what she owed and had enough left for a reasonable start on July. And the children were learning things. And the summer in the Nevada basin was brutally hot but clean-aired in a way that made breathing feel like a positive act. It was in the first week of July, on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was making the air above the main road shimmer, and the children had gone home early because of it, that Theodora walked to the east end of town to deliver a note to the Vasquez ranch for Ernesto's father, asking about whether Ernesto would be continuing in school through the summer session. She had not known Louis Barlow's property was literally adjacent to the Vasquez fence line. She had known it in the abstract geographical sense, but not in the practical sense that she would walk through the Vasquez gate and look 30 yards to the right and see Louis Barlow mending a fence post in the full heat of the afternoon sun. She delivered the note to Mrs. Vasquez, a quick and formidable woman named Alina who offered her lemonade, and 10 minutes of the kind of conversation that involves a great deal of information exchanged with very few wasted words. And then she came back out through the gate and stood there for a moment looking at Louis Barlow. She had rehearsed the thank you speech all the way from town. She had shaped it carefully, making it dignified and sincere without being excessive, acknowledging what he had done without making it mawkish. She was prepared. And then he had looked up with those dark eyes and she had opened her mouth and he had said, "Fence posts rotting at the base." She stood there. "Another 2 weeks and the whole east corner of the property comes down," he continued, pressing his thumb into the wood. Theodora Holloway, who had rehearsed a perfectly calibrated speech, said, "Can I help?" He looked up at her then. Not quickly, but the way he looked at things, with full attention. "You know how to mend fence posts?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm a quick learner and it seems like a 2-person job." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the post and then at her, and she became aware that she was standing in the afternoon heat in her teaching dress with her good hat on, and her sleeves buttoned to the wrist, and was offering to assist with manual labor. "Take my jacket," he said, standing and removing his work coat which he held toward her. "You'll burn straight through that color in 20 minutes. She took the jacket, which smelled of sawdust and something like cedar, and put it over her shoulders, and spent the next hour holding fence posts while Louis Barlow set them. It was not elegant work. Her arms ached with the strain of keeping the posts vertical while he worked the tamping iron. Her dress was dusty by the finish. She got a splinter in her left thumb that she extracted herself with the point of her own hatpin, while he was not looking because she was not going to mention it. But they talked while they worked, or rather they talked in the way that people talk when a shared task makes conversation easier, because there is something to focus on other than each other. He told her about the land, how his father had chosen this particular basin because of the water table and the angle of the hills, how the soil was alkaline but workable if you knew its nature. She told him about Ohio, about the girls' academy, about the way teaching felt different when you were teaching children who had real and immediate need for what they were learning rather than children who were being educated as a social performance. "Your students here," he said, setting the tamping iron against his shoulder, "most of them are going to stay in this territory, work land or mine or run commerce. What they learn from you is what they'll carry." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." He looked at her with that quality of attention she was learning to recognize, the kind that felt like being genuinely seen. "You teach like you understand that," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation stated as a fact. And it landed in Theodora's chest, with more weight than any compliment she had ever received. They finished the fence posts as the sun began to lower toward the western hills, and Theodora gave back his jacket and said she should return to town before the light went, and he said he would ride her back, because the road from the Vasquez ranch was not always safe after dark. She said it was not yet dark. He said the light was going and the road was not always safe after dark, and he said it with the same mild, immovable calm with which he said everything, and she found she did not mind. He rode her back on the road to town in the cooling evening, and she sat the horse beside him on the Vasquez mare that Alina had offered without being asked, and that Louis had saddled with the ease of a man who did things that needed doing. And the Nevada sky above them in the cooling hour was the particular color that exists only in the desert, pink and violet, and a shade of gold that does not exist in Ohio or Missouri or anywhere east. "Mr. Barlow," she said, when they were near the edge of town. "Louis," he said, which was the first time. She paused, not from formality but from the slight arrested feeling of something shifting. "Louis," she said, "what did you tell Philip Crane?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told him a few things," he said. "Would you tell me?" He looked at the road ahead. "I told him I knew about the land he'd bought through Gerald Holloway's company in 1880, and that I knew it was recorded incorrectly in the territory survey. Fraud, technically, though it was likely Gerald's doing rather than Crane's. But Crane signed the registration." He glanced at her. "I told him that I had a personal interest in whether he bothered you again, and that if he did, I would personally bring that registration to the Federal Land Commissioner at Carson City." She absorbed this. "He could have called your bluff," she said. "If you had not actually gone to Carson City." "I would have gone," he said simply. She looked at him. "You barely knew me," she said. He did not answer that immediately. They came to the edge of town, where the livery stood at the end of Main Street, and he dismounted and helped her down from the Vasquez mare and held the reins while she found her balance. He was close, briefly, very close in the way that the practical mechanics of dismounting made inevitable, and she could see the lines that the sun had put into the skin around his eyes and the slight tension at the corner of his jaw. "Some things don't require knowing someone long," he said, and then he stepped back and took both horses to the livery post, and Theodora walked to the boarding house with the evening sky above her, and something new and alarming and wonderful turning slowly over in her chest like a coin in water. July moved through its weeks with the slow intensity of Nevada summers, the heat building and cracking and building again, and the life of Rattlesnake Flat going on around Theodora with the ordinary, extraordinary detail of a community making itself out of nothing. She taught her students. She attended the Wednesday evening community reading group that Mrs. Lena Vasquez ran from her kitchen, which was the most intellectually engaged conversation she had found in the territory. She paid her board on time and wrote to her sister in Columbus, careful letters that acknowledged she was well, and said nothing about the specific nature of that wellness. Louis came into town twice a week, and she saw him both times, and the accumulated knowledge of him continued to grow in the detailed and particular way she was learning was how she experienced things that mattered to her. She knew that he was 31, which she learned from Alina Vasquez with a casual sidelong look that suggested Alina Vasquez understood considerably more about the situation than she expressed. She knew he had been engaged once, to a woman from Reno named Catherine, whose family had decided Louis's Nevada basin land was not prestigious enough, and who had gone back to Reno in 1879 and married a mining company investor instead. She knew Louis had not spoken much about this to anyone, and that Alina had told her with the particular gentleness of someone sharing a thing that explains a person. She knew that he read, which she discovered when she saw him coming out of the lending library, a small and somewhat optimistic enterprise run by the schoolmistress before her, Miss Patterson, who had married a rancher and left the school but maintained the library as a civic act. He was carrying David Copperfield, which told her something, and he saw her seeing it and he did not hide the book, which told her something else. "Have you read it?" she asked. "3 times, he said. "Once when I was young and didn't understand it, once when I was 20 and understood it in the wrong way, and now." "Do you understand it correctly now?" she asked. "Probably not," he said, "but it's closer." She laughed at that, and he looked at her laugh with an expression she filed away in the room she did not examine too closely. And they stood in the hot street outside the library for 20 minutes talking about Dickens and the nature of what we miss in our first readings, and how it is a mercy that books remain while we change enough to see them differently. She went home that evening and took out the letter from St. Louis and looked at it for a while, and then put it away again. In the middle of July, something happened that had nothing to do with her feelings and everything to do with the ongoing complexity of living in a territory that was still, in significant ways, inventing its own justice. There was a dispute at the south end of the county between a mining company operating under a territorial charter and 3 homesteader families, one of which was a Paiute family who had lived on that land since before the charter existed. The dispute involved a water diversion, which in Nevada is not a small matter, and it escalated from a legal filing to a physical confrontation in the space of a week. No one was killed, but the Paiute family structure was destroyed, and 2 of the homesteader families had their fences cut, and a man who worked for the mining company was shot in the shoulder by someone no one could identify, and the county sheriff went out to investigate and came back looking tired and said that the land office would need to resolve the underlying claim. Theodora heard all of this through the community telegraph. She heard it and felt the weight of it, the way injustice in small territories operates, how the force of legal instruments controlled by those with power bends around the actual human lives of those without it. She had seen it before. She had seen it her whole life, though the specifics shifted with the geography. She was not in a position to intervene. She was a schoolteacher on uncertain footing in a community she was still learning. But she had 3 students from homesteader families in the affected area, and one of them, a quiet girl of 9 named Sarah Prentice, had come to school for 2 days with the kind of hollow eyes that children get when the adult world has shown them something they were not ready for. Theodora had kept Sarah after the others left on Wednesday, and she had sat with her at the front bench, and she had not asked what was wrong, because the child did not need to be interrogated, but she had told her 3 stories. One about Ohio, one about her own mother's hands, and one about the specific kind of courage that is not about not being afraid but about doing the next thing anyway. She did not know if it helped. Sarah had gone home slightly less hollow-eyed, and Theodora thought it might have. She mentioned it to Louis on Thursday when she saw him at the dry goods store, not the whole story, just the fragment about Sarah, and he had listened with his full attention, and then he had said, "The land claim for the Paiute family. It's not properly registered, which means it's legally vulnerable. But the original occupation predates the territorial charter by at least 20 years. There might be a basis for a prior use argument if someone with standing brought it to the Territorial Land Commissioner." "Would you?" she asked. He looked at the middle distance. "I'm going to Carson City in August for the annual land records review. I can bring it up while I'm there." "That is not nothing," she said. "It's probably not enough," he said, "but it's something." She looked at him carefully. "You do that," she said slowly. "You take the something that's available even when it is not the whole thing that should happen." He met her eyes. "The whole thing that should happen often takes a long time," he said. "The something keeps people going until it does." It was possibly the most she had heard him say at once, and it was said quietly, but it landed in Theodora's understanding of the world with the resonance of something that was exactly true. She thought about that for a long time afterward. It was on a Thursday evening in late July that she told him her real name. They were sitting on the bench outside the library, which had become, by accumulation, a thing they did when they were both in town in the early evening, without either of them having made a formal arrangement. She had been teaching for 6 hours, and then attended a school board meeting that had involved 45 minutes of discussion about whether to add a second mathematics primer to the curriculum. And she was tired in the specific way that comes from spending energy on things that do not matter at the expense of things that do. He had brought her a cup of coffee from the hotel across the street, because he had been inside for a conversation about the land records and had come out with 2 cups as if it were the logical thing, and she had taken it without comment, and they had been sitting for a few minutes when she said, "My real name is Theodora." He looked at her. "Not Dorothea," she said. "The application said Dorothea Hallam, and I am Theodora Holloway. I told you the distinction when I first explained the situation to you, but I want you to know it clearly." She looked at the street. "I don't like that you know a version of me that is slightly inaccurate. It bothers me." He was quiet for a moment. "Theodora," he said, testing the name as if comparing it to something. "It suits you better." "You think so?" she said, faintly startled. "Dorothea is a softer name," he said. "You're not a soft person." He said it not as a criticism but as an observation, the way he said everything. "You're a kind person, that's different." She sat with that for a long moment, the evening cooling around them, the sounds of the town going about its end-of-day business, the smell of the coffee in her hands. "Louis," she said. "Yes, I think I should tell you something that may complicate things." He waited. "I think I am becoming extremely fond of you," she said, in the most measured voice she could manage, which was not perfectly steady, "and I thought you should know because I am not a person who is good at pretending things are not happening when they are." The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something that has been acknowledged and is being carefully handled. "You haven't complicated anything," he said after a moment. "I might," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not concerned about it." She looked at him. "You're very calm about this." "I've been aware of the direction of things for a while," he said simply. She felt something that was half relief and half what she could only describe as joy, which she had not expected to feel again in this particular variety. "The fence posts," she said. "The fence posts," he agreed, and something that was fully a smile moved across his face, unhurried and genuine and so entirely itself that she found she had to look at the street again for a moment. She wrote to her sister in Columbus that night, a different kind of letter, one that mentioned a man named Louis Barlow, and said she was beginning to think that coming west had been the right decision after all. August in Nevada was the kind of month that tested everything. The heat reached new definitions. The water supply to the south of town became a concern that occupied the community's attention almost daily. There was a fire on the Hendricks property 12 miles out, a barn lost and nothing else, but it shook people with the reminder of how quickly things could go. And there was a robbery at the Silver Eagle Hotel, a traveling merchant's lockbox taken in the middle of the night, which kept the sheriff occupied and gave the town something to discuss at length. Through all of it, Theodora and Louis continued their Thursday evenings outside the library and their Tuesday encounters at the dry goods, and their occasional and increasingly frequent simple time together. Walks along the edge of town when the evening cooled, or conversation on the porch at the boarding house where Mrs. Fenter, who was a perceptive woman, contrived not to be present. He took her to see his land one afternoon in early August, not formally, not announced as anything particular, but with the ease of a man showing something he cared about to someone he trusted. She stood on the rise above the basin where his house sat, a solid stone and timber structure built by his father with subsequent additions that Louis had made himself, and she looked at the scale of it, the miles of basin, the way the land shaped itself around the water source his father had identified, the fence line she had helped with, the Vasquez property visible to the east, the mountains beyond. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant the land, and she might have meant something else as well. "Yes," he said, and he was looking at the land, and he might have been looking at something else as well. Louis went to Carson City in the 3rd week of August for the land records review, and he was gone for 5 days, and Theodora discovered in those 5 days the full extent to which she had organized her week around his presence without being aware of doing so. The Tuesdays and Thursdays felt different in his absence, not empty exactly, but reduced in some way she could not account for by any practical explanation. She taught school. She attended Mrs. Vasquez's reading group. She had a long conversation with Roberto Ochoa the silversmith, who was a man of considerable knowledge about the territory's political history, and who she found increasingly interesting as a conversationalist. She read, she wrote letters, she did everything she always did. She missed him, and she did not pretend she did not. He came back from Carson City on a Saturday, and she found out he was back on Sunday through Mrs. Fenter, and on Sunday afternoon she walked to the east edge of town and along the road toward his property with no particular plan except the direction of her own feet. He was sitting on the porch of his house when she arrived, which was not typical, which meant he had not fully returned to his routine after the trip. He stood when he saw her on the road and came down from the porch to meet her at the gate. "Theodora," he said. "I came to see if you were back," she said, which was obvious, and she didn't mind it being obvious. "I'm back," he said. "How was Carson City?" "Successful," he said. "The prior use argument has standing. They're going to review the Paiute family's claim at the next session. It's not a resolution, but it's a step." "Louis," she said. "Yes." She stepped through the gate that he was holding open, and she stood on the path between the gate and the porch, and she said, "I am not fond of you. I told you I was becoming fond of you, but that was not accurate. I am considerably past fond." He looked at her with those dark and direct eyes and the slight tension at the corner of his jaw that she now knew meant he was feeling something he was keeping within a careful measure. "So am I," he said. "Past fond," she confirmed. "Considerably," he said. She took a breath that came out slightly uneven. "I have a very complicated history," she said. "I am here under circumstances that are not entirely above board. I was married for 4 years to a man who was not actively cruel but was consistently selfish, which in the end amounts to the same thing in terms of what it does to a person. I had a frightening situation follow me here that you already know about. I am not, in other words, a simple proposition." "I know all of that," he said. "And," she said, "and I'm not looking for a simple proposition," he said, with the quiet and absolute certainty that was entirely his own. She looked at him for a long moment in the afternoon sun of August in Nevada, and she thought about Gerald Holloway, who had leveraged her gratitude, and Philip Crane, who had tried to leverage her fear, and every man she had known who had understood her as a function rather than a person. And she looked at Louis Barlow, who had changed the subject when she tried to thank him and talked about a fence post, who had done a difficult thing for her and then pretended it was incidental, who had ridden her back to town because the road was not safe after dark and called it practical, who had brought her coffee because he happened to have 2 cups, who had listened to her tell him she was past fond of him with the steady, whole attention of a man who had been waiting for the thing he wanted and was not going to mishandle it now that it had arrived. She stepped forward. He met her. And when he kissed her, it was the way everything else about him was, complete and unhurried and entirely genuine. And Theodora Holloway, who had come to Nevada running from a dark past with a borrowed name and a borrowed direction, felt something inside her that she had been holding very tightly for a very long time slowly, carefully, release. They stood on the path between the gate and the porch in the August afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a while, and neither of them needed to. She had dinner at his house that evening, the first of many times, though she had not known that yet. He cooked because he was a practical man who lived alone and had learned to feed himself, and the food was plain and good, and they talked through the evening about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the boundary between those categories kept shifting in interesting ways. He walked her back to town in the cool dark, because of course he did, and at the gate of the boarding house he held her hand for a moment and said, "I'll come to town on Tuesday." "I know," she said. "I'll come specifically," he said, with a slight emphasis that was as close to expressive as he got. She smiled at him in the dark. "I'll be at the school until 4, she said. 4, he said, and released her hand and walked back toward the east edge of town, and she watched him go for a moment before going inside. Mrs. Fenter, who was in the parlor sewing and entirely innocent-looking, said, "There's cold supper left if you're hungry." "Thank you, Mrs. Fenter," Theodora said, and went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the cracked plaster of the boarding house wall, and felt the peculiar and precious experience of a future that had suddenly opened up where she had not expected to find one. September came, and with it the new school year and new students, and the particular productivity of autumn after summer's relentless heat. The Nevada basin, which had been baked and cracked and severe, turned in September to something more forgiving, the light becoming long and amber, the mornings sharp and clear, the evenings cool enough for a wrap. The situation with Philip Crane had been resolved in the way that Louis had predicted, which was through the specific leverage of the 1880 land registration. She learned the full details from Louis in early September, in the way that they had developed of telling each other things completely when the time was right. Crane had received a letter from the federal land commissioner in early August, which was Louis's doing, informing him that the Carson City office would be reviewing the Southern Nevada land filings from 1880 through 1882 in detail. Crane, who had several things in those filings he did not want reviewed, had quietly requested a transfer to a different territory. His replacement in the regional land claim work was a deputy named Morrison who had no history with Theodora and no interest in creating one. The trap had been dismantled. The dark past was, not erased, but placed behind a door that could now stay closed. Theodora went to the school board in the second week of September and told them the full truth about her name and her sister's credentials. She did this not because she had to, since the immediate threat was gone, but because she had decided, in the clear air of an autumn morning, that she was not going to build what she was building on an unsettled foundation. She told them she was Theodora Holloway, not Dorothea Hallam, that her sister had died, and she had taken the position because she was qualified to hold it and needed it desperately, and that she believed her teaching work had demonstrated the legitimacy of that qualification. The school board met that evening. Louis was not at the meeting because she had not asked him to be, because this was hers to do. She sat in Mrs. Fenter's parlor in the evening and waited, which was one of the harder things she had done in Nevada, and when the board chairman came to the boarding house at 9 o'clock that evening, his expression was not what she expected. "We want to keep you," he said. "The children are learning. The community values the school. We've voted to retain you as the consolidated school's teacher under your own name, with a written acknowledgement of the irregularity on file with the County Board of Education." He paused. It wasn't a close vote. She thanked him with a steadiness that she mostly felt. She went upstairs and wrote to her sister in Columbus, a letter that said several true things, and then she went to the window and looked at the Nevada dark and thought about how sometimes the forced choice turns out to be the one that leads somewhere worth going. October brought the thing she had not predicted, which was the conversation about the future in the specific and practical terms that Louis approached everything. He came to the school one afternoon when the children had gone, which was unusual, and he sat on the edge of one of the larger student benches in the way that a large man sits on furniture that is too small for him, with the self-possessed calm of someone who has decided it is what he is doing and is not going to be embarrassed about it, and he said, "I want to ask you something." She put down the stack of arithmetic slates she was carrying. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, with the direct simplicity of someone who does not see the point of circling the actual thing. "I want to do it properly, with the time you need to consider it. I'm not expecting an immediate answer," he looked at her, "but I wanted to ask." Theodora Holloway, standing in her schoolroom with arithmetic slates in her arms, looked at Louis Barlow perched on a student bench, and she thought about the question he had asked and the manner in which he had asked it, with care and room and honesty and no performance. "My answer is yes," she said. "I don't need time. I've had the time. The answer has been yes for a while, and I think you know that." He looked at her with the expression that was fully a smile, which was rare enough to still stop her breath slightly. "I had a sense," he said. "You could have asked earlier," she said. "I wanted to be sure you were staying because you wanted to," he said, "not because you needed to." She put the arithmetic slates down on the front bench and walked toward him. "That," she said, is possibly the most thoughtful thing anyone has said to me in my adult life." He stood up from the undersized bench, which was a relief to both the bench and the general visual proportion of the room, and he took her hands, and she looked up at him in the afternoon light coming through the school's single east-facing window. And she thought that the thing about Louis Barlow was that he was the kind of man who you fell in love with because of who he was, not because of what he did, though what he did tended to reflect who he was with remarkable consistency. They were married in November. The ceremony was at the Rattlesnake Flat Community Hall, which served as the meeting place for every civic function in the town, because there was not yet a proper church building, though the community was saving toward one with the determined optimism of a frontier town that knows what it is going to be even before it is it. The justice of the peace was a man named Howard Wells, who had the ceremonial gravity of someone who understood that the legal and the meaningful were not always the same thing, but that it was worth trying to make them overlap. Elena Vasquez organized the reception in the way that she organized everything she touched, which was with a combination of deep competence and complete disregard for obstacles. The Vasquez family provided food that was better than anything else in the territory, and Seth Granger from the livery played fiddle with unexpected skill, and Mrs. Fenter cried in the restrained way of a woman who considers overt emotion slightly unseemly, but cannot entirely prevent it on particular occasions. Ernesto Vasquez, who was Theodora's most excellent student and had been reading 5 grades above level by October, gave a small speech that no one had asked him to give about how Mrs. Holloway, he meant Mrs. Barlow now, had told him that knowing things was a tool of survival, and that he had thought about it and decided that it was not just survival but also living, and that he was glad she had come to Rattlesnake Flat. He said it with the self-possession of a 9-year-old who has never once been told his opinions are not worth hearing, which was partly his own nature and partly the result of having had a teacher who meant it. Theodora had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Louis shook Ernesto's hand as if he were shaking the hand of an equal, and Ernesto stood slightly taller for it. They went back to the stone and timber house on the Nevada Basin after the reception, in the November dark, and Theodora stood in the house that she was going to live in now and looked at it with new eyes. It was solid and plain and full of the kind of detail that accumulates when someone has been somewhere long enough to make something truly theirs. There were books on the shelves, more than she had expected, and a good iron stove, and a kitchen window that looked east toward the mountains. "I want to put a garden in," she said, thinking aloud. "In the spring, on the east side where the morning light is good, something practical, vegetables and herbs." "The soil is good on that side," he said, "better drainage. And something for flowers," she said, "something that isn't practical. Also good," he said. She turned from the kitchen window and looked at him in the lamplight, this man she had married, with his dark eyes and his unhurried quality and his complete and steady self, and she thought about the fence post that had been rotting at the base, and the thank-you speech she had never delivered, and the moment when she had understood that being relieved of gratitude was one of the most valuable gifts a person could receive from another. She would tell him that, she thought. Not tonight, but sometime. She would tell him that the moment she loved him was the moment he changed the subject, and she wanted to see what he would do with that information. She had a fairly confident prediction about what he would do, which was that he would look at the middle distance and say something practical and quiet and entirely true, and she would find that she loved him more for it. Winter settled over the Nevada Basin with the particular severity of high desert winters, cold and clear and sharp, the nights enormous with stars and silence. The school continued through the cold months because Theodora believed in continuity, and she had the parents' support because the children were learning things that mattered and they knew it. She added a geography component in December, large paper maps that she drew herself from the county survey maps at the land office, because she believed you needed to understand where you were in order to understand where you could go. Louis went to Carson City in December for the follow-up on the Paiute family's land claim, and came back with news that was not complete justice, but was movement in the right direction. The Territorial Commission had acknowledged the prior use claim and had placed a stay on the mining company's development pending review. It was not a full resolution, but it was the something that kept people going. He reported it to her with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, and she listened and felt proud of him with the specific pride that comes not from accomplishment by association, but from watching someone you love be exactly who they are in a situation that calls for it. January brought 2 feet of snow in the second week, which Rattlesnake Flat handled with the pragmatic adaptability of a community that did not have the luxury of being surprised by weather. The school closed for 3 days during the worst of it, and Theodora used the time to plan the spring curriculum and to help Louis with the animals, which she had been learning about with the same focused competence she brought to everything. She was a good student, which he had told her once, and she had told him that she considered it a professional obligation to be what she expected of others, and he had looked at her with that quiet smile and not said anything. She found she loved the pauses as much as the words. It was in February, on a cold, bright morning when the snow on the mountains was blinding white, and the sky was the deep blue that only exists when the air is very clean, that she told him she thought she was expecting. She told him quietly, in the kitchen, with the matter-of-fact directness that was becoming the register of their most important conversations, and she watched his face. He looked at her for a long moment, and what moved through his expression in that moment was something she filed permanently in the room she now examined very frequently, because it was the fullest thing she had ever seen in his face. It was not just joy, though it was that. It was the larger thing that contains joy, the thing that is about time and permanence and trust, and the risk that turns out to have been worth taking. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands, not urgently but with the quality she associated with how he held things that mattered with care and complete attention, and he said, "Theodora." "Yes," she said. "I am." He started and stopped, and she could see him searching for the word that would carry the actual weight. "I know," she said, and she did. He kissed her forehead and her cheek, and then her mouth, and she put her hands over his hands that were cupping her face, and the February light came through the kitchen window that faced east toward the mountains and fell across them both. Spring came to the Nevada basin in April with the specific sudden drama of the high desert, brown to green in what felt like a week, the sage and the bunchgrass, and the morning glories coming up along the fence lines, with an urgency that always surprised Theodora, no matter how many times she saw it. She put in her garden on the east side of the house as she had planned, practical herbs and vegetables, and a border of something she bought from the general store in a paper envelope labeled simply "flowers mixed," because sometimes you needed the impractical thing. School let out for summer in late May. She would return in September. She had told the school board, and they had received this information with relief that she found gratifying. She was not going to stop teaching when the baby came. She had made this clear in the particular tone she used when making things clear that she considered non-negotiable, and Louis had told the school board with the mild certainty of someone reporting established fact that Mrs. Barlow's teaching was her own business, and she would determine it herself. And no one had argued, because arguing with Louis Barlow about something he had decided was like arguing with the stone and timber quality of his house, which was that it did not move. She loved him for that too. Their son was born in August, on a blazing hot morning with Dr. Whitmore, the county physician, present, and Elena Vasquez present, because Theodora had asked her to be, and because Elena Vasquez was not the kind of woman who was diminished by difficulty. Louis was outside on the porch because that was where Dr. Whitmore had directed him to be, and he stayed there through the whole of it with the particular controlled stillness of a man who is frightened and will not compound the situation by showing it. He came in when it was over, when Dr. Whitmore had said it was done and done well, and he stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at Theodora in the bed with the small wrapped reality of their son in her arms, and his face did the thing it had done in the kitchen in February, the thing that contained the large category. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed with the careful balance of a man who understands when something is more fragile than himself, and she put the baby in the crook of his arm and watched him look at his son for the first time. "Hello," Louis said to the baby, in the quiet voice he used for things that mattered. He said it simply and directly, as if the baby were a person he was being introduced to, which was exactly right, and the baby, who had the dark hair and the particular grave expression of someone taking inventory of a new situation, looked in the general direction of Louis's voice with the blind, purposeful attention of the newborn. "What shall we call him?" Theodora asked. He looked up at her. "You had an idea," he said. "I did," she said. "James, after my father, not Gerald's side of anything." "James Barlow," he said, testing it. He looked at the baby again. "James," he said to the baby specifically. "James." The baby had no response to offer, but his expression seemed to indicate he was not opposed. She leaned her head back against the pillow and watched Louis hold his son with the careful completeness that was so entirely himself. And she thought about the arc of the last year and a half, the terrified woman who had stepped off the train at Mineral Wells with a borrowed letter and a buried future, and the woman who was in this bed, in this house, in this life, watching this man. She thought about the thank you speech she had never delivered. "Louis," she said. "Yes," he said, not looking up from James. "There is something I want to say to you," she said, "that I tried to say once before and you talked about fence posts." He looked up at her then, with a slight shift in his expression that meant he was paying particular attention. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not for any one thing, though there are specific things that deserve specific thanks, and I intend to give them eventually. But I wanted to thank you for being the kind of man who exists in the world the way you exist in it. Who does what is needed and does not make it a performance. Who made room for me to be exactly who I am without requiring me to make myself smaller." She looked at him steadily. "I had never encountered that before, and I want you to know that I know what it is, and I am grateful for it in a way that goes past words. But I am going to try to say it anyway, because I think you deserve to hear it even if it embarrasses us both." Louis held their son in his arms and looked at his wife, and she could see the slight tension at the corner of his jaw that meant he was feeling something he was keeping within a careful measure, and she watched him prepare, in the way he always did, to change the subject. And then he stopped, and he looked at her with the full, direct, unhurried attention that was his finest quality, and he said, "Theodora." "Yes," she said. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm grateful, too, for everything you brought here, your honesty, the way you teach, the way you argue with me when I'm wrong, which is less often than you think and more often than I admit." The corner of his mouth moved. "The flowers you planted that aren't practical." "They're very practical," she said, "for the spirit." "Yes," he said, "for the spirit." He looked at James for a moment and then back at her. "I didn't change the subject this time," he said. She smiled at him. "No," she said, "you didn't." He looked at her with that expression that was fully a smile and fully something larger than a smile, and she felt the warm weight of it in her chest, settling there like something that had always been meant to be there, and had finally, by some combination of accident and intention, and the particular mercy of having ended up in the right place, arrived. Autumn brought the school year, and James began his life in the manner of a child with two people looking after him, who did not believe in doing things halfway, which was with excellent health and an apparently considerable opinion of his own situation. Elena Vasquez, who became his honorary godmother by general agreement rather than formal ceremony, said he looked at the world already like someone who expected it to explain itself to him, which she considered a good sign. Theodora went back to teaching in September with James in a basket by her desk for the first weeks, until the arrangement with the Vasquez family could be properly established, which was that their eldest daughter, Lucia, 15 and careful and entirely trustworthy, would come to the school each day to tend to James during school hours in exchange for advanced reading lessons that Theodora gave her in the early morning. It was the kind of arrangement that worked because it was honest about what everyone needed. The school grew in that third year, more families coming into the territory, the community of Rattlesnake Flat pressing outward in the direction of a real town. There were now 41 students, which was too many for one room, and Theodora went to the school board in October with a proposal for expansion that was so detailed and so clearly thought through that the board approved it in one meeting, which was not their usual pace. Louis had helped her prepare the presentation, not by doing it for her, but by asking the questions that sharpened the argument, the way he helped with everything. The Paiute family's land claim was partially resolved by the Territorial Commission in the winter of 1883, with a ruling that preserved approximately half the original land and placed restrictions on the mining company's water diversion. It was not complete justice. Louis said so plainly, and said that the legal mechanism had limits that the political situation hadn't yet expanded. But it was the something. The family remained on their land. The children attended Theodora's school, 3 of them. A girl named Winona who was 8 and precise and excellent at mathematics, and 2 younger boys who were still learning English and learning everything else alongside it with the remarkable adaptability of children. Roberto Ochoa, the silversmith, commissioned a piece that year, a small silver clasp for a book cover, that he gave to Theodora in December with the quiet ceremony of someone who expresses large things through small gestures. She asked him what it was for, and he said it was for bringing a school to the territory that taught all the children in it, without the rankings by family or language that some Eastern schools maintained. She thanked him and meant it, and wore the clasp on her journal for the rest of her life. Christmas of 1883 was the first one in the house on the basin with the family it had become, Louis and Theodora and James, with the Vasquez family at the table for dinner and Mrs. Fenter present, because she had accepted the standing invitation with the gracious efficiency of a woman who had been waiting to be asked, and Seth Granger, who came for an hour and stayed for 4 because the conversation and the food were both excellent. Theodora made something sweet from a recipe her mother had used in Ohio, a kind of spiced cake that required ingredients she had ordered from the supplier in Carson City months in advance because she had planned for this. Louis looked at the cake when she brought it to the table with the expression of someone who has been given something that was expensive to give and is trying to find the right words. "You ordered the spices," he said. "In September," she said. He looked at her. "September," he said. "I wanted to do it right," she said. He put his hand over hers on the table, in the simple and complete way he had of expressing things that were too large for words, and she turned her hand over and held his, and the table went on around them with its noise and warmth, and James in his basket by the hearth made the sound he made when he was contented, which was a small and absolute sound like something deciding to stay. The second child came in the spring of 1885, a daughter this time, born in April with the same efficiency that characterized the basin in spring, sudden and decided and entirely present. They called her Clara, which was Theodora's mother's name, and which Louis accepted with the same quiet ease with which he accepted most things she proposed that came from something real in her. Clara came into the world with fair hair that was entirely inexplicable given the parentage, and Alina Vasquez said it was the land reasserting itself, and Louis said it was probably recessive, and Theodora said she didn't care where it came from because it was beautiful, and all of them were probably right. James, who was 2.5 and had recently developed very strong opinions about the organization of the world, received Clara with the cautious assessment of someone encountering a new geological formation. He stared at her for a long time, and then reached out one small, careful finger and touched her hand, and she gripped it with the instinctive strength of the newborn, and his expression changed to something that Theodora recognized as a form of wonder. "Baby," he said, which was not precisely true anymore but was the word he had. "Your sister," Louis told him. James looked at Louis, and at the baby, and back at Louis, and then apparently decided this was acceptable information, because he moved on to other investigations of the room. The school expanded properly in the fall of 1885. A second room added to the original building, and a second teacher was hired, a woman from Sacramento named Miss Agatha Prine, who was practical and good with the younger children and who Theodora liked immediately, which was not something she took for granted. The community of Rattlesnake Flat had grown by then into something that required the word town without qualification. There was a proper hotel now to replace the Silver Eagle, a bank with a real vault, a newspaper that came out twice a week with the particular voice of a frontier editor who understands that news in a small community is partly journalism and partly social maintenance. There was a church building finally, a plain wooden structure that held the community's various denominations with the democratic pragmatism of a place that knows it needs one building more than it needs doctrinal precision. The injustice of the territory was not resolved and probably would not be in their lifetimes, Theodora had come to understand. The forces at work in the land, the mining interests, the land speculators, the slow machinery of federal administration, were larger than any one community's moral clarity, and the people who bore the cost of them, the Paiute families, the Mexican homesteaders, the small ranchers against the large ones, were fighting battles that would take generations. But the school continued to teach all the children that came to it. Louis continued to go to Carson City every year and bring what arguments he had to the people who needed to hear them. Roberto Ochoa, the silversmith, continued to be an excellent conversationalist and an even better craftsman, and Winona, who had been 8 and precise and excellent at mathematics, was by 1886 the best arithmetic student in the territory's entire school district, which Theodora reported to the county superintendent with the relish of someone proving a point that needed proving. There were years that tested things, because frontier life tests things, and there were years that were simply good, and there were years that were both. There was a drought in 1886 that required the kind of sustained community problem-solving that either breaks a community or proves what it's made of. And Rattlesnake Flat proved what it was made of with the unsentimental determination of a place that has been hard-won and is not willing to give it back. Louis lost 2 of his horses to a fever in the spring of 1887, which was a financial blow and a genuine grief, because he was not a man who kept animals without caring about them. Theodora watched him work through it with the focused practicality of someone who does not have the time to grieve at length, but does not pretend not to. She said nothing particular about it except what was true, which was that she was sorry, and she sat with him on the porch in the evening and let the sitting be what it was. She found him in the stable the morning after the second horse died, standing in the empty stall with his hand on the post, and she went in and stood beside him and put her hand over his, the way he had done at the Christmas table, in the simple and complete way of expressing things that are too large for words. He covered her hand with his other hand, and they stood there in the early morning stable light for a few minutes, and then he said, "I need to write to the breeder in Sacramento." "I know," she said. "But not this moment." He looked at her. "Not this moment," he agreed. James started school at Theodora's own school in the fall of 1887, which created a situation they had discussed with care, namely how to be both teacher and mother in the same room for the same child, without it becoming something problematic for either the child or the other students. They had decided, Louis and Theodora, in one of their kitchen table conversations that resolved most things of importance, that James would be treated as any other student in the school, with exactly the same standards, the same expectations, the same consequences. Louis had told James this directly in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for true things. James, who was 4 years old and already bearing the particular gravity of children who are raised by people who speak to them honestly, had considered this and said, "What about when I know the answer?" "Then you raise your hand," Louis told him. "What if I always know the answer?" James asked. "Then you wait sometimes," Louis said, "so the other children have a chance to find it." James thought about this. "Okay," he said, in the tone of someone accepting a reasonable position. He was, as it turned out, consistently the first to know the answer, which Theodora had expected, and he was inconsistently patient about waiting, which she had also expected, and she handled it the way she handled all her students, which was with the combination of firmness and genuine regard that had defined her teaching since Ohio. Clara started school in the fall of 1890, 5 years old and fully in possession of her own personality, which was to say that she had Louis's directness and Theodora's refusal to be diminished, and an additional element that appeared to be entirely her own, which was a kind of creative lateral thinking that meant she solved problems by routes that no one had anticipated. She was going to be interesting. Theodora had been saying since Clara was 3, and the school confirmed it. Louis turned 40 in November of 1890, and Theodora organized something she did not tell him about in advance, which was a gathering at the house on the Nevada basin of the people who mattered to him, which was a shorter list than some men's and a more precisely chosen one. The Vasquez family, all of them, Elena and her husband Carlos and the children including Ernesto, who was now 17, and already talking about going to school in San Francisco, because Theodora had been writing to the University of California on his behalf, with the particular determination of a teacher who understands that sometimes you have to hold the door until the person you're holding it for arrives. Roberto Ochoa, Seth Granger, who was 73 and had slowed down considerably, but was still managing the livery with the help of his son. Mrs. Fenter, who had become family by the same gradual and undeniable process by which Mrs. Fenter became family to everyone she decided to keep. Agatha Prine, who had been teaching alongside Theodora for 5 years, and who was now also engaged to a man from the Territory Survey Office, which Theodora had noted with satisfaction. A handful of ranchers and neighbors that Louis respected, and that Theodora had come to know well. She had made the spiced cake again, which had become a family tradition by this point, and she had ordered the spices in September, which Louis knew she did and had stopped pretending to be surprised by. He came back from the south pasture on the evening of his birthday to find the house full of light and the people he trusted, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with the expression that contained the large category, and then he came in and was quietly, completely, genuinely present for the whole of the evening, which was the highest compliment he could pay a room. Later, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep and the house was quiet with the particular quality of aftermath, they were in the kitchen doing the washing up the way they always did it, side by side at the basin, and Theodora said, 40 years. So it appears, he said. How does it feel, she asked. He was quiet for a moment, washing a cup with his characteristic thoroughness. Adequate, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her with the expression that was fully a smile. More than adequate, he said. Much more, she said. Considerably more, he agreed and handed her the cup to dry. She dried the cup and put it on the shelf and thought about a woman who had stepped off a train at Mineral Wells with a borrowed letter and a hidden name and a future that was more damage than direction. And she thought about a fence post rotting at the base. And she thought about a man who had said, "I'll speak to him," with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who was going to do exactly that. And she thought about all the Tuesday and Thursday mornings and the evening rides and the kitchen conversations, and the children sleeping in the next room, and the garden on the east side of the house, where the flowers that weren't practical had been growing for 8 years now, and were doing very well. Louis, she said. Yes, he said, drying his hands on the kitchen cloth. You changed the subject, she said. He looked at her. When, he said, the first time I tried to thank you, she said, I had rehearsed a speech. You said the fence post was rotting at the base. He considered this. The fence post was rotting at the base, he said. I know, she said. That's not the point. What's the point? He asked with a slight quality in his voice that meant he already knew. The point, she said, is that it was the moment I loved you. She looked at him steadily, with the same directness she had been using for 8 years now and would use for the rest of her life. And I have never properly said so. I say I love you, which I do and which I mean, but I have never said specifically that the fence post was when it happened, and I want you to know it. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight of their kitchen, and she watched him prepare, as he always had, to change the subject, and she waited as she always would to see if he would. He said, I was going to say the lending library. She blinked. What? That was when it happened for me, he said. You asked if I understood Dickens correctly now, and I said probably not, and you laughed. He looked at the lamp. I'd never had anyone ask me that. Most people ask what a book is about. You asked whether I understood it correctly. He looked back at her. That was the moment. She stood in her kitchen in the Nevada basin in November of 1890 and looked at the man she had married. And she thought about all the moments that had made this moment. All the fence posts, and the lending library, and the thank you speeches, and the Carson City trips, and the children sleeping in the next room, and the 8 years of ordinary, extraordinary days. And she thought that the thing about a life built on the right foundation was that it did not move. She crossed to him, and he held her with the complete and unhurried quality that was so entirely himself. And she put her face against his shoulder and thought that she was going to tell Ernesto Vasquez, when he went to San Francisco, that the most important thing about education was not what it gave you access to, but who it made you capable of seeing. She would tell him that later. For now, the lamp burned in the kitchen and the children slept, and the Nevada dark was enormous with stars. And Louis Barlow held his wife with the steady certainty of a man who had found the thing he wanted and was not going to mishandle it. And Theodora Holloway Barlow, who had come west running from a hidden motive and a dark past, and had arrived at something she had not known to look for, was home.